Welcome to our participants and panelists from our global produce sector. My name is Ron Lemaire. I'm the chair of the Global Coalition of Fresh Produce and president of the Canadian Produce Marketing Association, located in Ottawa, Canada. This webinar will last 1.5 hours and will focus on the economic sustainability in our global supply chains for fruit and vegetables, with presentations on recent trends in markets for fruit and vegetables worldwide by Cindy van Ryswyk, global strategist with Rabobank, as well as an overview on the results of the Coalition's recent survey on producer prices and costs by members of the Global Coalition from around the world. We're also going to give a perspective on the relationship between suppliers and retailers and competition, bargaining power, margins, price transparency, all provided by Alan Renwick, professor in agricultural economics at Lincoln University in New Zealand. As well, we'll have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the consumer value perception and willingness to pay for fruit and vegetables, being presented by Nicolo Cooley, advisor with Eurocommerce. At the end, we're also going to wrap up on a positive note. So we want to talk a little bit about the prospects for a dynamic fruit and vegetable sector, and we'll have members of the coalition talking about their perspective of where things are going regionally and internationally as we get to the end. As we move through the presentation, please use the Q&A tool to pose questions. That Q&A tool is located at the bottom of your screen, and you can pose questions at any time during the session, and we'll be monitoring those and hopefully be able to answer them as we move through the presentations. We do have a lot of information to get to, so let's get started. The Global Coalition came together during the end of the pandemic when food systems continue to struggle, and many of us within our sector were looking for answers or solutions to our challenges. The Global Coalition of Fresh Produce brought together fresh produce associations from around the world on a joint vision to create a resilient global value chain for fruit and vegetables that bring a myriad of economic and environmental and social benefits to systems around the world. The coalition's mission is to voice solutions to address disruptions in global supply chains for fresh produce, including but not limited to rising costs, and to work and share best practices amongst us. This webinar is a tactical example of our efforts. The coalition is made up of 10 associations. This dynamic group truly represents the global marketplace and a significant flow of fresh fruit and vegetables within domestic and international jurisdictions. We include AFRIBANA, the Association of Banana Exporters of Ecuador, the Canadian Produce Marketing Association, the Committee Linking Entrepreneurship, Agriculture Development, COLEAD, FreshVal Europe, the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, the International Fresh Produce Association, the Southern Hemisphere Association of Fresh Produce Exporters, and United Fresh New Zealand. We're going to have a chance to hear from the group later in the session, where we will have regional overviews from Europe with Joanna Nathanson from FreshVal, from out of Africa, Stephen Menta from COLEAD, New Zealand, Paula Dudley from United Fresh, Australia, Lucy Gregg from OzVeg, as well as South America with Sergio Del Castillo from SHAFE, and out of the United States, Robert Gunther. Wrapping up the session, we'll have that focus on prospects for a dynamic sector, and we'll have opportunity to hear from Europe, as well as from Canada, and as well as from Africa. As I mentioned, we have a wonderful slate of speakers on our agenda, but before we get started with a review of the trends in the marketplace for fresh fruit and vegetables worldwide by Cindy, I would like to ask our participants to participate in a few poll questions. The poll's going to help us frame who's joining us online, but also give us some insights and perspectives relative to your thoughts on the current impact on costs. If we could launch the poll. Okay, and let me quickly run through. So we have a strong representation from around the world with Canada, the United States, Africa, Europe, South America, Mexico, and New Zealand. And we do have Australia here. I don't know if they were able to log in to their vote. Representation, we have strong grower, packer, shipper at 25%, an importer at 25%, marketer, we have some retail representation, as well as farmer-only representation. So actually a very balanced group across the participants. Interestingly, so when we look at the impact of costs overall, everyone has seen in the last year more than 5%. So 13% of the respondents felt that they have costs of more than 5%. 33 more than 10%. 33% of the respondents had 15% higher costs. And this is the concerning point, with 21% with 20% higher costs. And we're going to talk a bit about that as we see the survey results from our coalition survey. Where we look at the cost impact, similar to what we saw in the Global Coalition survey, it's interesting. Petrol and fuel very high, machinery costs very high, packaging is at over 55%, logistics over 60%. We're seeing, interestingly, fertilizer price costs at 33%. Out of compared to everything else, we are recognizing some of those fertilizer costs are dropping. We'll talk a bit about that. No surprise, labor is still very high, and seed inputs is also high as well. When asked the question, when do you anticipate seeing costs decrease? This is not a surprise. We have a lot of individuals unsure at 79%. It is a crystal ball. And we're hoping by the end of 2024, 2025, but I think we're seeing more and more that the unsure nature of where the markets are going is key. Okay, thank you everyone for participating in that survey. I think that really sets the stage well. And with that, I think we'll move over to our first panelist and introduce Cindy to share her screen and begin the session on looking at the trends on the fruit and vegetable marketplace on a global level. Cindy, I will stop sharing and it's all yours.
Thank you, Ron. And the impact of the long-term trends I will be discussing is actually the same. It's moving all to not a very positive outcome, but I think producing and shipping fresh produce will become even more expensive in the future, as well as more complicated. But this also gives opportunities for the best growers and to suppliers to stand out from the crowd. But let's go back to it's not a top 10, but a top 9 of trends that I will run through today. First trend that's really a change against 10 years ago, for example, a new world order. So the world is definitely changing, and it will not be that easygoing marketplace that it has been over the past few years. We see already some countries having more difficulties to export, more protectionism. This is also a Europe sort of new fashion to become more protectionism. We see local initiatives popping up to produce more local food for the local markets. There's more difficulties shipping produce into China, to Russia. So we see countries closing the markets either for exports or imports when prices are moving into the wrong direction. So I think this is a major change, and I will not see this reverting in any time soon. Another big trend, this is actually random order, so it's not the top 10 from 1 to 10 or 10 to 1 or 9 to 1, but environmental risks, of course, frequently discussed climate change, but it's just more than that. It's drought, it's natural disasters, it's a lot of things happening. And this year has showed that this is kind of impacting fresh produce producers, but also shippers all around the world. And we're pretty sure that this extreme weather will become the new normal. And this will lead to more volatility in the market, higher production costs, and also higher investments needed in climate adaptation. So, for example, covers to protect crops and lots of other measures. But some of the solutions can be in ag tech. We see a lot of new developments in agtech. Technology is really moving into the field, sometimes slowly, more slowly than anticipated. But there's a huge opportunity for technology to replace labor, but not only to replace labor, because not all of it will be replaced, but also to help labor, to make workers, to make work in the field more easy, and also to produce more sustainable. Actually, I think replacing manual labor will be quite complicated and will take many years before we get picking robots, for example. Replacing brains is much easier. So we already see with artificial intelligence that a lot of vision and thinking can be replaced quite easily. So for manual labor, it will take more time. So my job is probably easier to replace than a job of a tomato picker. But eventually, we believe that this will happen and it will provide opportunities. But it will also change the global and the playing field, the competition. So robots will move into the field and workers will move more and more out of the field. Actually, the availability of workers, increasing labor cost, issues with housing for laborers is a global problem. We see this in many, many countries, and it's getting worse. We don't think this is a temporary problem, but in many markets, we see that the age dependency ratio is decreasing. So that means that more and more people that are not who are not working are dependent on a decreasing group of workers. So, and this will lead to increasing labor costs and the need to automate work. Maybe this will also have other implications in the long term. For example, growers that will choose different crops to grow that are easier to harvest, and so on. So that could have far-reaching implications for the fresh produce suppliers. Also, in the supply chain, there are some shifts. So there's more power at the downstream side. There used to be quite some power on the upstream side. So big agrochemical players, big farm input players. I foresee that their power is decreasing a bit, and more power also with farmers, actually, because of the volatility and increasing complications for farmers to grow the crops that consumers are needed. Their role becomes more important. What we also see in the long term is that there will be a shift from monoculture to more higher diversity. So in the last decades, the global fresh produce industry has tried to become more efficient, to grow more and more at large scale. But I think we have reached somehow the limits of this system, and we will see more diverse production systems, more adapted to local growing circumstances. So next to large-scale production, we will also see more opportunities for niches, differentiated products, and also a more targeted approach to the local growing circumstances. But often this will also come with a cost. And what this graph is showing is that when you move from, for example, a conventional crop rotation scheme or land use to an organic crop system, you already see a much different crop mix. And that will also happen in fresh produce. Another, I think, very positive trend is that nutrition is really on the agenda, not only for governments, but also for retailers even. Also, the digitization helps with that. Labels on Nutri-Score, EcoScore, all of that helps to promote fresh produce. currently, we don't see yet that despite the attention for healthy foods, that consumption is really growing at the cost of less healthy products. But I believe in the long term, and this is a slow process, that the fresh produce market is a very robust market with potential for growth. More and more people, and especially governments, will realize that we have to move to more nutritious diets, also because of more sustainable production systems. So that's definitely, yeah, very important and very promising for the produce sector. Another trend is, okay, we want to have more healthy food, more sustainable food, but we also need more crops and agriculture production in general. So it's not only crops to grow to feed a growing population, but also we want to have more crops for fiber, for fuel, for feed, and even for decoration. And that's really will require a lot of additional land or higher yields or smarter systems or less waste. So that will be a big puzzle. And but there will also be more and more questions raised about how sustainable is fuel, how sustainable is to grow crops for ornamental purposes. But anyway, this is one of the main challenges going forward for the food system. And I think, yeah, as fruit and vegetables are key in a healthy diet, they will be very high on the priority list for all of these different food, feed, and fuel crops. So we want more produce, more food, more crops, but we also want less input use, less water use, less chemical use, less fertilizer use, and technology will definitely help with that. But yeah, that will take some time because it's a huge challenge now. All the regulation coming to us, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Farmers are and growers are forced to reduce some of the inputs to produce more environmental friendly, but that will also come with a cost, and who will pay for that? That's the big question. But some of it can be solved with precision farming, indoor farming, more technology use, but that also requires investments. So that's a very short overview of some of the trends that me and my colleagues in our fresh produce research team see for the coming decade. So on the one hand, it's some positive news. So there's lots of opportunities, but on the other hand, we don't see fresh produce production coming cheaper anytime soon because of the labor issues and all the other issues that are more long term. So maybe there's some easing of cost for logistics, packaging, fertilizers right now, but in the long term, so labor costs will only increase, and also some of the other cost factors will only go up. So I think it's time that, yeah, stakeholders realize this, and that the right prices and right margins are surpassed along the supply chain.
Cindy, that's really a great presentation because I think you framed up well.
Okay.
We all know there's opportunity, and I think the piece that we're really starting to see is, especially when you talk to the benefit of nutrition, but also the leveraging of where we see innovation going is going to be key. I know as we move through this, we're going to hear a little bit about regulatory burden and some of those challenges because best of intention on policies and strategies around sustainability with unintended consequences, I think we're all experiencing on, as you alluded to, some of those impact on cost centers. So how do we get there? I think we'll talk a little bit about further on. But that is fabulous. Everyone, questions and answer. There's a box at the bottom of your screen. You can post questions in the Q&A box. Please do that because they're easier to follow than in the chat box. So please pose your questions in the Q&A box. with that, I will go back to sharing my screen, and we will move into the next piece of the presentation, which will look at some of the details that we found in our survey that we put in the market, and it really does build on Cindy's presentation. So moving through, I'd like to start off looking at a global perspective and then move through with our coalition members to frame their regional perspectives as well. So as I mentioned, in the spring of 2023, the coalition launched a global survey, and it provides a clear narrative highlighting for industry and its partners and all levels of government the current impacts of the increase in production, operating costs that we heard already, and most specifically, though, how we can work together to address them. As you can see from the chart, the global averages on minimum cost increases were 18%. And, while in this just ad hoc poll we did earlier today, we saw fertilizer lower in everyone's view on this webinar. When we did this survey, we saw fertilizer maxing out at 60%. So this is a global average, and it's significant when we start looking at that downstream impact on the grower and farmer and grower, packer, shipper, but then how that filters through the entire supply chain. What I can say is most operators were able to increase their selling price with rises of 11% in Europe, 13% in Oceania and South America, 14% in North America, and 23% in Africa. However, in most cases, these increases were not enough to compensate for the rise in production and operating costs, leaving nearly 3/5 of the global industry selling at a loss or breaking even, as reported in the spring of this year. So spiking costs have really affected what's unfortunate, strategic and operational choices. Certain producers noted that they've reduced their output. Some of the traders noticed that they reduced their export activities or switched to produce with lower shipping costs to try and account for the challenges. 80% of the respondents noted that they were delayed or canceled investments in their business. This is a massive concern relative to future growth. So looking at not only reductions in capital and or equipment, but also in innovation and expansion. And without this, our industry stalls. And I think, we are an industry that pivots, adapts, whatever word you want to use. This is truly a point that we need to consider relative to how we continue investments and what the public-private relationships are. How do we drive change, and how do we ensure ongoing investment in growth, even with the high impacts of inflation and operating costs? As we saw, we don't have a crystal ball. So what does the future look like? So with that, I want to quickly go into a focus from a regional perspective, and I'll take the opportunity to talk to the Canadian perspective, the fruit and veg growers of Canada. Some of those members are on the call today, as well as my members. We were able to get a fairly robust view of what the market looks like, and I'll share some of that with everyone today, and then move on to our other coalition members. What I'll say is the system we live in is very complex, and there's no one solution. Overall, operators signaled a significant increase in production costs and operating costs, and peaks here in water, fuel, gas, fertilizers, similar to what we saw on the global level. The front end of the supply chain, or the growers, have noted in the survey work that they've been unable to command higher prices for a range of different reasons. Most cited were their lack of bargaining power, in some cases rejection of price increases, and in some cases even canceling purchase orders if other suppliers had lower price. A lot of this being driven due to domestic price competition, due to consumer reluctance to pay more, especially during this period of food inflation. Other growers stated that they face stiff competition in Canada from the international markets, and markets that can export product grown under different policy and tax frameworks. Also, survey noted that there's a significantly more operators, fortunately in Canada, making a profit than breaking even. That was a positive. And there was noted that many of the respondents, while they may have been seeing sales margins increase, they were lower than compared to 2019. Looking at the Canadian market as well, we saw a significant majority of respondents state that the rising production costs and operating costs have significantly also impacted their investments, similar to the global markets, not only capital and equipment, but also their innovation and expansion. Operators were very cautious to invest generally, especially looking at riskier investments. And a lot of that rationale was cited because of high interest rates and inflation. What's interesting is one of the respondents, when we did this survey, noted that the cost of investments may have risen even after purchasing. So driving the clarity of that initial investment and then continued operation and limiting access to cash that they needed because of timing of how the market shifted. Similar to the global perspective, looking at choices and how do they need to make choices to save where they can save in Canada. Interestingly, in Canada, while there was some support federally and provincially, nothing significant relative to compensation for the rising production costs and operating costs, which was something that many of the, from grower to wholesaler and even within the retail environment, noting that it was a concern relative to how government could potentially support driving forward. When we start looking at the future, there was some note that they are starting to see some costs going down. So fertilizer was one example, but even with that cost reduction in some areas, labor and the impact on business relative to domestic policy that is creating unintended consequences to their business. Examples: carbon taxes and sustainability strategies at a federal level that were being put in place that were dramatically impacting business and the increased cost of production being now required to push the consumer. So with that, I'll stop because we do want to try and push through this fairly quickly. And I'd like to go to the United States and ask Robert Gunther of the International Fresh Produce Association to give the perspective from the U.S. Robert.
Great. Thank you, Ron. I could almost say ditto to your analysis of Canada when you talk about a lot of the things that are, came up in our survey. But let me kind of just walk through this with you. And again, we want to get through all of these different presentations and look forward to questions and discussion. So I would say overall and unanimously, most of the respondents from the United States of America agreed that there were significant increases in production operating cost over the last 2 years. In fact, there was about a 24% average across all category increases. Again, what Ron mentioned in input cost, when I look at when we look at the data, fertilizer, crop protection products, fuel, gas, building costs, shipping, all kind of rose up in terms of areas that we saw cost of productions increase significantly during COVID and coming out of COVID. Another area I would say, and again, very echoing what Ron said, the rising labor costs are cited as one of the most pressing challenges. Nearly all the respondents stated that their selling price has gone up over the past 2 years, mostly by an average of almost 19%. However, for the majority of the respondents, which was about 60%, the rise in selling prices not kept pace with the rise in production and operating costs. In fact, only 1/5 of the respondents have been able to raise their selling prices in line with the rising costs. Just again to kind of further illustrate this, some of the main reasons seem to be, competitive issues, prices for various reasons. The most common reason seems to be competitive pressures from the international markets, imported produce. And this also was coupled with the lack of bargaining power between resellers and supplier that have been, according to some of the survey recipients or survey takers, refused to increase prices in line with rising operating costs. Another one, which is unfortunate from a U.S. perspective, is they cited that dampening consumer demand is another reason for these issues. So just to kind of walk through some more areas, about 75% of the respondents state that a rising production and operating costs have impacted their investments of all types. So that's mostly like capital investments, investments in equipment, but also innovation and expansion. I can tell you anecdotally, talking with many folks here in the U.S., many of our members here in the U.S., they have really questioned how much they can expand their operations, whether to build new facilities. They're growing operations because of a lot of the areas, in particular on labor, quite frankly, is one of the areas they cite, that the lack of labor and the concern with, with a supply or reliable labor force is one of the major issues driving that. Operators are also reluctant to invest in considering their current business environment. In fact, one of the vegetable producers indicates that the rise of costs has led to a dramatic reduction in capacity and output, and may lead to the closure of one or more of his production facilities, just as I said. About 83% of the respondents indicated that the rising costs have impacted strategic and operational choices. The impact is felt as a reduction in business choices, the need to develop new business approaches, and pressure to reduce output and capacity and limit exports. So again, as you can see, very similar to what Ron mentioned of the Canadian sector of the industry. Very, very similar concerns that are here in North America. I'll close with kind of with what the outlook was, and it's really a mixed bag. And again, this is a snapshot in time. This was done earlier this year, and we're now looking at kind of where we are today. But when we talk to when the surveys results came back, at least from the United States perspective, about half the operators believe that production and operating costs will go down by the end of 2023 and into next year, mostly because of packaging and ocean freight costs. However, the other half believe the costs will continue to rise, really some as much as 10% across the board, and especially related to the cost of labor, utilities, and raw materials that would be driving that increase. So very mixed bag, in between the two kind of people who did the survey for this based on the United States. But again, very similar to what we're seeing in Ron and what we're seeing in Canada as well. So Ron, I'll turn it back over to you, and thank you for allowing me to do this.
Thank you, Robert. That was very insightful. And you know what, there were a couple questions as you were speaking. One about taking consideration that waste is a big part of our problem, and shouldn't we look at reducing waste instead of growing production? I won't ask you to answer that, but I'll ask that as we go through this, our panelists, if you can consider that question, and if you have any thoughts, pose an answer or frame. And I'll come back to you in a second, Robert, to give your thoughts quickly. And then also on what countries are posed to take advantage of the cost challenge right now by increasing their production and export to other countries to fill the void that's being created by a reduction in domestic production, which is a great question. So Robert, let's real quick, because I know we want to get to the others, but first on waste, is that an opportunity?
So I think it is, but I think I would answer it a little bit differently than what the attendee mentioned here. I wouldn't say we need to reduce production, but also we got to find better ways to help with finding markets, finding customers for products that, quite frankly, are in not being utilized in the marketplace. So how we can do that, again, opening up new markets, increasing market access in a number of areas. And I think that how we are going to be able to do that is, what this coalition is really all about is making sure that, we have working very closely with a lot of the international bodies to broaden the scope of what fresh produce is why it's important to the world economy and driving world consumption for our industry.
So Cindy, really quickly, your thoughts.
I was already typing some.
Okay.
in the chat, in the Q&A box. But one of the questions on waste, I think that, we can still reduce a lot of the waste in the industry, so we don't need to expand the acreage per se. So I think there is part of solution in that. And also in still producing more with less land and less inputs by using technology, there's lots of opportunities. But there's some regions in the world like Europe where production is already quite stagnant and even decreasing. So there is a change visible already. And also in the US, Australia, most of the mature markets, we don't see that much growth anymore in produce being grown. So,
Agreed. So let's save the answer on opportunities and let the others answer that if they have any thoughts on country of opportunities as we go through it. So, because time is going to run out on us, perhaps what we can do is move on to Europe. And we're fortunate to have Joanna Nathanson here from Freshfell. And Joanna, maybe you can get perspective of Europe, and if you have any thoughts on those countries of opportunity and or waste as you go through your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Ron. As if I start with the European perspective, as has already been mentioned, it's a very complex landscape. Of course, there is no single reason or single solution to this. In Europe, inflation and high costs continue to be the reality of for the sector. And although the peak of increased costs hopefully is behind us, the extreme spikes from 2022 and beginning of 2023 are still being felt by both consumers and the fruit and vegetable supply chain. Costs remain at a high level, and the logistics of fruit and vegetables is still under pressure. And it's very important to note that we are not yet out of the inflation spiral, and that together with the many impacts of climate change and extreme weather events now on production, it will be a challenge to fully cover the cost of production for some time to come still. And what we find in Europe as well is that there is a very widespread misconception about fruit and vegetables, especially on affordability, and that they are driving food inflation, which although there is a great instability when it comes to cost and selling prices, fresh produce has really remained quite affordable in Europe, with some products actually experiencing deflation earlier in the year. But even so, as also mentioned already, the demand and the consumption of fresh produce has declined in the latest year following COVID, and the current EU average is still well below the minimum recommendation from WHO of 400 grams. Not to mention the recommendation of at least 800 grams that came from the Nordic Nutrition Council earlier this year. And this decline in demand is even more noticeable when it comes to premium products. And so this untrue idea that fresh produce is unaffordable, it's very harmful for public health and towards the move towards sustainable food systems and a sustainable economy. In reality, fresh produce is really among the more affordable and nutritious food, while also having, as has been mentioned as well, one of the smallest environmental footprints. And these facts must really be communicated to the consumers. And now, as Europe also heads towards winter, the energy prices will again become a bigger part of household expenditure, and that will also affect consumer purchasing power, which risks driving down the demand even more and making the economic situation even more difficult. So from our side, we really need that consumers can be correctly informed about the affordability and sustainability and health benefits that come from fresh produce, and that through this that we can increase consumption to secure not only public and environmental health, but also the economic sustainability of the fresh produce sector. And I think I will leave it at that. There is more to be said a bit later today as well, but as I understand, we are a bit short of time as well.
I think you framed that very well, Joanna, and I think that will lead well into our next presentation by Stephen from the African perspective. So let me hand it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about his perspective from Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you. As we are all aware, Africa, we have over 55 countries with different types of climates and other agric systems. But generally, if you look at the recent price hikes of inputs, they cut across. So generally, the issue of high production costs persists in most areas of Africa. My issue, which is of interest to me, and I hope to all of us here this evening, is to how do we address this particular issue, which I think will not be a one-off, but it will be persisting. Even if it subsides a bit, it is something we are going to live with. So my interest is in the midst of all these high costs of production, what do operators do to be able to mitigate some of these issues to assure an economic sustainability of businesses? And I want us to zero in on something that has happened in Ghana in respect of pineapple production and export. Pineapple production is key in other sub-Saharan African countries like Togo, Benin, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and others. And this explanation I'm going to give pertains almost exactly like what happens in these other countries. So when we realize that in the past 2, 3, 4 years, price hikes are making it difficult for the pineapple industry in Ghana to survive, what we decided to do was to actually do an investigation, a research and development of the production practices vis-a-vis comparative costs on the various varieties of pineapple that we produce in Ghana. I mean, we had to survive. So we went deeper into this exercise. And we realized that out of the 3 varieties, that is MD2, Smooth Cayenne, and Sugarloaf, one came out strongly that the production costs were low as much as 35%. That is a Sugarloaf variety, which means that operators will be in the position to survive these current price hikes if they did something about this variety. Maybe focus on that, invest more in that, and be able to survive these pressures. As I said, these pressures are not one-off. They may be persistent. So resulting from this exercise, now more attention has been made towards this variety, which provides less expenses in terms of production costs. Comparing this to the MD2, which was produced in Central America, the production cost per hectare of MD2 is about $8,000, but the Sugarloaf is just about $5,000. So we are saving almost 40% of cost. So my interest tonight is to how do we mitigate these incessant price hikes so that our businesses can survive, can be sustainable for the future. And I think investing in research and development and then diving deeper into the reasons of these costs and how we can turn around our practices to take advantage of the results of some of these exercises that we do. So in effect, what I'm saying is that from the African continent, these price hikes are real, but how do we get around it? So the answer is investigate further into production practices vis-a-vis these high production costs and arrive at practices that can mitigate these costs and make our economies sustainable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. And I think you hit it right on the head where Cindy was framing some of the thinking around that innovation of change and production. And I think you definitely hit a couple key points there. So now moving to South America, we're fortunate to have from SHAFE Sergio del Castillo, who will talk about the South American perspective.
Yes, thank you, Ron. Thank you, everybody, to listen to me. Yes, we are very concerned what's happening with these all increases in the operating costs. South America suffers from the same from other part of the world with high prices in fertilizers and shipping. Even this last year, those prices went down. There were not enough to bring profit to most of the growers. We have to think that in South America there are a lot small and medium-sized growers. Those growers are suffering a very bad these increases of cost. Most of them, they only 75% of those could translate the increase, some of the increase to the prices, but they were not enough to make a profit in the last 2-3 years. I can take growers who are managing all variety, for example, on oats growers in Peru, at least, and surrounding countries like Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil are losing, are going out of the business. A lot of growers are losing their fields and creating a lot of poverty in our countries. So we need to find a solution in this because they will create at the end, in the long term, problems in all over the world, because the volume will decrease. For example, in Peru, this is after 20 years of the trend of being increasing in our fruits and veg exports. This is gonna be the first year that we're gonna have a drop because the climate problems. Or now we are starting just for the whole world a new phenomenon El Niño, which affects to all the crops around the world. In the countries, on the places that they were supposed to rain, they will rain more, and in the other place will have a drought. So we can see in the coming year, at least from South America, a stagnation in the volume of the fruits and veg. And that's very concerned because you cannot switch very fast to other crops or to other varieties that can be more competitive, for the market. More production with better quality, with less consumption of inputs, but this require an investment, that is not happening right now. So I see very great, the future, in South America, if we don't translate to the final prices, all these increases of the costs. So we are also concerned that more regulation is required by the recipient of our products. Every time we have more and more regulation for sustainability, which is good, but all that will bring more cost for our operations. So, and we want to clear up if the final consumer and the supermarket chains are willing to accept those increasing costs that's gonna come in the next years. With the ones that we already have, we have to deal, but there are more coming in the following years because all this new regulation will demand more investment in our crops. So that's our perspective. What's happening in South America? We believe that if we don't get a solution, we're gonna create more poverty in our countries. The production will concentrate in less companies, bigger companies. At the end, the consumer will be in less hands, and that's not good for the market.
Thank you, Sergio. And you know what? I think your point on the consolidation in the market, the loss of the small farm, we're starting to hear a little bit of that everywhere. And your point on the example of Peru and the stagnation of growth and the decline now. I know the North American market, Canada, relies heavily on the Peruvian imports for citrus and off-season products. And it's seeing that shift in access to different production bases and farmers will definitely create global implications. And I think we're seeing that across multiple jurisdictions. Let's move to Australia. Thank you, Sergio. And I'd like to ask Lucy Gregg from OzVeg. Lucy, thank you for joining us. I think at a bright and early hour in Australia. So thank you for accommodating us as well as our next speaker from New Zealand. But right now we're in Australia, so it's over to you, Lucy.
Great, thank you very much, Ron. As per our global colleagues, Australian vegetable growers have had to grapple with substantial price increases as well, particularly on inputs such as fertiliser and fuel. Our growers are heavily reliant on overseas inputs across the supply chain, such as seeds, chemicals, fertilisers, machinery and packaging. Australia's relative isolation in global logistic terms and lack of sovereign capability certainly tested our ability to produce fresh produce during and since the COVID-19 pandemic, and still underlies our call for a national food security strategy. Like elsewhere, whilst Australian growers have received increases in selling prices, they have not been sufficient to compensate for rising production and operating costs. Inflation, severe weather events, increasing compliance, significant biosecurity threats, and chronic workforce shortages are just a few of the challenges that growers have faced in the last few months. In recent months, near perfect weather conditions across the country has now caused an oversupply of fresh produce and very deflated retail prices, a turnaround from the high prices seen last year during significant flooding. And many growers are reporting that they are currently receiving prices below cost of production. People would know in Australia we have a duopoly, and major Australian supermarket retailers, Coles and Woolworths, have just posted massive profits and in turn received some consumer backlash as Australians battle rising inflation. However, whilst low vegetable prices may appease consumers in the short term, the long-term consequences for the industry may have significant negative ramifications for consumers in the future. With the Global Coalition survey showing nearly 60% of growers are selling at a loss or break-even position, the long-term economic sustainability of our industry is certainly under scrutiny. These results were also reflected in our recent workforce sentiment survey, which was conducted in July this year, with vegetable growers questioning their future in the sector and more than 30% of growers now considering exiting the industry in the next 12 months. The survey also highlighted that 72% of growers is currently experiencing workforce shortages. 94% are expecting that the workforce shortages will worsen or be on par with current conditions by summer this year. And 45% rate their future viability with current workforce shortages as poor or very poor. Workforce shortages were reported across all school levels and work hours from full-time to casual. And a changing migration policy was expected to make this situation worse, not better. With 6% of Australian vegetable production exported, any significant retraction of the industry would have a significant impact on fresh produce supply here in Australia. And shortages are expected to be reflected in rising consumer prices. Although the Australian vegetable sector is forecast to grow by at least 1 billion in annual farm gate value by 2030, lack of reliable workforce may well put this target in jeopardy. Australia, often referred to as the land of plenty, seriously needs to assess whether fresh produce is an essential or a luxury, albeit that they may be good news for growers who can survive the current crisis. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you. And that's a telling narrative relative to where the status is. And that 6% export number is extremely interesting relative to domestic stability if things change dramatically. So, Lucy, thank you for that narrative and scope. So let's move over to New Zealand now, and from United Fresh New Zealand, Paula Dudley.
Thanks, Ron. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Paula Dudley, General Manager of United Fresh down here in New Zealand. Just to give you a bit of background about what's been going on down here, very similar to what Lucy just said. During COVID, no workers were allowed in at all down here for over a year, meaning we had no pickers, packers, etc., driving our labour costs up by around 27%. And then in February, we were hit by Cyclone Gabrielle, destroying some of our growing areas in the North Island. So apples, pears, citrus, all for export, were decimated. Some growers still recovering, and some may never recover, unfortunately. Further flooding in our biggest city, Auckland, and Northland regions took out quite a chunk of our vegetable crops. So we've had many challenges, as we've heard from everyone else, they have too. Onto the survey results for New Zealand, respondents all agreed in New Zealand and globally that the production costs have risen. 50% of our respondents said they were breaking even, while 25% were running at a loss, saying they were unable to pass on the rising production costs to their buyers. The rising production costs have impacted investment down here. Also, equipment, plant, innovation has all suffered. 75% of respondents couldn't see the prices going down this year because of inflationary pressures in New Zealand and around the world. There was a little bit of good news that some reported that both sea and air freight was easing. So that was something for the end of the survey. And I'd just like to wrap on a positive note from down here in New Zealand. Our government has just passed a new environment bill which will protect growing fresh fruit and vegetables and increase food security in New Zealand, meaning fertile land will be prioritised for fresh produce. This hasn't happened in the past, so that's good news. We've also seen the introduction of the Grocery Industry Competition Act. Same as Lucy, we have in Australia, we have a duopoly here in New Zealand. This act is designed to promote competition and efficiency in the grocery sector, hopefully resulting in better value for Kiwis buying fresh fruit and vegetables so they can get their 5+ a day for better health. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And interesting, and you know what, the easing freight costs, I think we're seeing that, but jurisdictionally, it's interesting where they are and where they aren't. So we'll talk a little bit about later. And your grocery code, so to speak, I think we're seeing more of those around the world. With that, perfect segue to Alan. And Alan, I will hand it over to you, where we're going to hear a little bit about that relationship between buyers and sellers and some experience Alan has in this area. So Alan, it's all yours. I will stop sharing and let you take over.
That's okay.
Yes.
Good morning here from New Zealand. Yeah, thanks. So it was really interesting to hear the roundup of what's going on, and I think it does fit very closely to some of the things I'll be talking about today. So I was asked really to talk about the supplier-retailer relationship in the fresh produce sector and think about bargaining power, margins, and transparency. And I'm very aware of time, so I will try and keep myself to time as I go through this. So some things I will talk about very quickly, but hopefully leave some space for questions. There's probably a lot more to discuss. These are big topics really for us. So really, I just want to talk a bit about the suppliers and retailers, the market and buyer power of retailers, what this means, particularly in the fresh produce sector, some of the policy options. We've already heard a couple of mentions of grocery codes of conduct, etc. Today, and then think about some of the effectiveness of these policy options. And perhaps at the end, trying to be more positive, what else can be done to try and improve the situation in the chain. Now, I know you all work in this area, and so I probably don't need to tell you, but obviously, well, to me, I think the fresh produce supply chain is a thing of wonder. And it is amazing how we get from the field to the supermarkets in Lincoln at the bottom of the world here, where we are in New Zealand. And clearly, this is a complex process involving a whole range of different interactions. But obviously, supplier-retailer relationships are crucial to the efficient and effective functioning of the fresh produce chain. I just have one example of our chain in New Zealand, which would be very used to seeing by our United Fresh colleague. So this is work done by the Agri Chain Centre. But we can see also some work done in Australia, which just highlights the complexity. But there's many challenges within this chain, and no greater challenge than trying to deal with the tensions between suppliers and the retailers themselves. Now, clearly, we don't need to go on for this a long time, but obviously changes have occurred over a period of time in this sector, which means that the retailers really are holding the market power. Now, there's an official definition. When you have market power, you can raise prices without losing customers to competitors. But of course, they've got market power in terms of selling to customers. But really, what we're concerned is with the market power in terms of buying from their suppliers. And as the increasing agglomeration and aggregation of our retail sectors has meant that this power has increased. And this means when we're thinking about the bargaining and the discussion that we have an imbalance of power in retail supply, okay, obviously, and the OECD sort of classify this when you have buyer power, when a buyer can credibly threaten to impose a long-term opportunity cost, i.e. harm or withheld benefit, which were the threat carried out would be significantly disproportionate to any resulting long-term cost to itself. And we have on the right here sort of a characterization of our food chain. We've already talked about the power here with the agrochemical feed, and it was interesting to hear Cindy say she felt some of that power might be reducing in relation to farmers. But of course, we've got here for us today is this power here with the supermarket buyers in this. So really, we've heard quite a lot today about some of the challenges in the sector. We've got these rising costs right through our chain, going up from the input suppliers, farmers, processors, and the supermarkets themselves around the issues with labour, fertilizer, etc., right through the board. But really, what I guess is the question about the impact of this is if we think about the supermarkets, if they have power, they have, in a sense, the ability to push the prices up to consumers to increase their profit, but also to push down on the prices to the rest of the chain below them, the processors, the packers, the farmers, etc. Meanwhile, the growers here are just, facing input supply prices rising. But I think a key thing that we can see is in regions where the supermarkets are fighting much more, perhaps, than we have in Australia and New Zealand with our rather cozy duopolies. But we also see now downward pressure coming from consumers. Here's a little headline about meltdowns, dumped trolleys, rise of food price anxiety in New Zealand. This global rise in food inflation has really put a spotlight on supermarkets, and in New Zealand and maybe in Australia and maybe otherwhere, they're beginning to bear the brunt of consumer concerns about the cost of living. And you will see, even in our election campaign, I saw an advert from one of the parties saying, "We will tackle the supermarkets." They're getting the blame, in a sense, for the whole process of price rises, which means that consumers are sort of pushing down and back to the supermarkets. The supermarkets are trying to protect their position by not passing on these price rises. And this is what really is beginning to cause even more problem further down the chain, because the supermarkets can't maintain their margins by pushing up to consumers. They're trying to maintain those margins, I guess, by not passing on price rises, pushing down. And I think that's what we can hear a lot of from today. And this really is exacerbating, the very traditional cost price squeeze on those in the middle. The input suppliers' prices are going up, the supermarkets' prices are coming down, payment prices coming down, though we're being squeezed in the middle here. And linked to this, obviously, it's when you have buyer power, this can then lead to some abuses of that buyer power. And obviously, a lot of work has been done around the globe looking into issues around unfair trading practices. And again, lots of evidence, anecdotal evidence and hard evidence of unfair trading practices. So this kind of links to the fact that even if the price may seem reasonable, there may be a range of other factors in there: delayed payment, retrospective demands of payment at the end of the year from suppliers. The whole range of practices that are likely to be going on here. But of course, these again put pressure on those supplying it. And again, they can only really be an issue around unfair trading practices when we have an imbalance of bargaining power. If the bargaining power is equal, then basically, if you've got an opportunity, you will go elsewhere. But clearly, when these customers are 80 or 90% of your business, and you're a much smaller part of their business, your options to go elsewhere are much more limited, and that's where the power will come from. So why does it matter? I think we've really heard a very good list of reasons why it matters today. We've heard about lower investment. We've heard about reduced innovation. We've heard about producers possibly going out of production. It suppresses competition. And, again, one of the other things about buyer power is that risk gets put onto others and not onto the supermarkets. And we see lots of work that has shown that when shocks occur to the supply chain, the risk and the impact of those shocks is pushed down and goes down to the producers at the bottom, really. So we have, and we've talked about waste already today, all these things are kind of outcomes of it, so huge impacts. And so this does impact beyond, in a sense, the suppliers. It impacts society. And again, if we have lower investment, reduced innovation, in the long run, this may well even increase the prices to consumers and make things worse there. And we highlighted, Ron's also mentioned, to look at the supply chain more and grocery code of conduct in Canada. Clearly, across the globe, there are more and more, calls, more and more studies, more issues highlighting these problems in our supply chains, culminating in unfair trading practices. And interestingly, in the UK at the moment, there's an inquiry into basically thinking about how profitability and risk is shared. And this idea of fairness is interesting when we're thinking about margins and returns. What does a fair food supply chain look like? I think is a very interesting question for us. So as we said, there are, in a sense, lots of pressures on governments to try and address these. And we can really say there's four main ways policy can affect, redress some of these imbalances or make competition stronger in our retailer sector. So effectively, we can affect the structure, prevent ownership of businesses owning different parts. So basically the link in New Zealand, a lot of discussion between a link between wholesalers and retailers, those sorts of things. Idea about mergers and acquisitions between supermarkets, even threats to break up supermarkets. Or in New Zealand, again, we've had lots of discussion about how they might encourage new entrants to increase competition. On the other hand, we can think about the work that's being done in Europe, Australia, and even in our new rules in New Zealand to try and encourage opportunity for cooperative bargaining, right to form cooperatives, producer organizations. So to try and go against the antitrust that you can't discuss prices, etc. And then the second sort of thing, so that's trying to affect what's going on in the structure of the industry. But the other way really to work is say, well, they accept that this imbalance exists, but they try and regulate it through unfair trading practices, contracts, trying to improve transparency. And then there's also the enforcement. It's all right having a code of conduct, but you obviously need to enforce it or try and and again, you've got a very imbalance here. One person, one party of the group will have a lot of resources, a lot of power, the other doesn't. Can you help support the weaker party in dispute resolution, these sorts of things? So really we can see across, the chain, if we're thinking about it, the sort of work is to stop them merging, to try and stop the power getting there in the first place, try and prevent the vertical integration that may be increasing that power. There's threat to break up some of the supermarket chains. In New Zealand here, we can see the idea of having, encouraging the introduction of a new chain. We can think about how we can get producers to act more collaboratively to try and increase their power on this. So that's the way affecting the structure. Or we can think about here introducing codes of conduct, supply chain contracts, thinking about ombudsmen to oversee these contracts to try and have power on the retailers. Lots of discussion about improving transparency, about prices and where they are through the chain, but also about markets and improving that. But obviously in such a complex supply chains as we have for fresh produce, that's quite a challenge in itself. And then there's obviously the thing about supporting legally or dispute resolution in here. But what we see in many countries is that many of these different activities are occurring to try and redress this imbalance in power, to try and reduce some of the impacts of that. But the real question for us, I think, is it's great and a lot of work going on in government to try and encourage collaborative bargaining, producer groups, increase the transparency through it, bring in the statutory codes of conduct, have ombudsman regulator trying to overlook it. But when we really look at it, I mean, it's not saying it's ineffective, but a lot of the situations are have they really improved the situation for suppliers? I think is the key question for us. And I wasn't sure quite the right word to put here. I put inconclusive. I think there are evidence that producer groups can perform better than when they're individually. Transparency can improve the situation in the thing. Statutory codes of conduct, again, the hard evidence perhaps of them, clearly changing the situation is harder to find, but there is some evidence. So I would say inconclusive here in this. And we think about the idea of this, producer organizations. If you think about the negotiation between our fish and the shark here, they're sort of rather outnumbered. The fish go away and come back all together. And then this is perhaps the way to do it. But of course, these individual fishes, it's much harder for them all to work together to counteract the one shark. And, so there's mixed evidence about it, but more and more countries, I guess, are bringing regulation to allow collective bargaining, producer organizations, cooperatives to try and tackle it. Code of conduct, I haven't got time to speak too much to this, but we can see in this the supplier surveys in the UK where they've had a code of conduct for quite a while. But we can see down here, only 8% of suppliers have actually raised an issue with retailer. And this is always the thing for me of a code of conduct. Yes, it's fine. You can try and support them. But when you have such a person and a weaker partner, are they really going to complain? Are they going to go to the ombudsman? Because even if they win that case, there's always the threat of delisting, because at the end of the day, it's a commercial decision by supermarkets who they deal with. And that's always going to be a problem with there. A lot of said about transparency. You'll be pleased I'm not going to go through all this slide, but all I wanted to sort of highlight is there's potential benefits around about fairness, efficiency, market competition through transparency. But in fresh produce and other areas, there might be potential that we become too focused on price, and this actually could lead to a situation where innovations missed out, and we become much more focused on price, which may not necessarily be good for those in the supply chain. So, I guess the question is that regulation is good and pushing for policies to help support it, but some of the evidence of actually really solving that fundamental issue of the imbalance is not hugely clear. So I guess what we've got is, are there lots of other things, are other things that can be done? Can suppliers add value-added services? I guess it's about inventory management, developing and strengthening these supply chain partnerships right through it, so become more indispensable to the supermarkets and increase your power that way, offer them better quality assurance. Also thinking about reducing reliance, diversification, direct sales, differentiation. But of course, this is still very difficult when the major customers, in New Zealand, 80 to 90% of food is bought through the supermarkets, two supermarkets. It's very hard to get to the market without going through them. Obviously, we've talked today already a bit about efficiency gains, and that's a possibility there. Or another role is for advocacy. So I will probably end here saying, the sort of role that you've got here, advocating for the supply chain sector, is fantastic, and again, can maybe help the situation. Okay, so I will stop there.
Thank you, Alan. And you know what? In a very short period of time, you framed that up extremely well relative to the complexity of how relationship works and the code concepts. And it's interesting around, I know we're looking at it in Canada strategically, how we move forward, looking at voluntary versus regulatory and where the power and how do you implement it. It's an extremely complex system, as you've outlined. So thank you for that. Now, I'd like to move on, and we will have our next speaker. So it's one thing to talk about all of the policy framework, the challenges on cost, but at the end of it all, the consumer does play a significant role. And we're fortunate to have Nicolo here with us from Euromonitor, who's going to talk a little about Eurocommerce, who's going to talk a little bit about what does the consumer actually play in this whole thing. So Nicolo, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is for you. And many thanks for having me. My name is Nicolo Ciulli. I'm an advisor at Eurocommerce. That's the EU Federation for Retail and Wholesale. So we represent national associations in almost all European Union members, plus direct members. We have all the major retailers and wholesalers, both for food, but also for non-food. So I would also have a lot to say about the presentation that we just heard from Professor Renwick, but I think that might need a couple more seminars. And yeah, what I would like to talk to you about today is about willingness to pay for fruit and vegetables by consumers, especially in this moment and in this these very complicated economic circumstances. So I'm not sure I will give an answer to the question, are consumers willing to pay? It might be the classic answer. It depends. Maybe not now, maybe in the future. What's the interplay with sustainability? Are consumers willing to pay more for sustainable products? It depends. But I think here there is the possibility for all supply chain actors, retailers, primary producers, and everyone in between, to think about this together and see if we can solve this problem through collaboration. And there's already plenty of examples, at least in Europe, of collaborations, farmers, processors, retailers, or farmers, retailers, if it's the case for fresh food, on how to solve many of the issues that we've talked about today. We've heard about food waste, emissions, and the likes. So yeah, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what is going on, mainly based on data, and this is all European data, but I'm sure that it's not that different in all your countries. what we think, yeah, the macroeconomic situation is slightly improving. So inflation, at least in Europe, is slightly down. These are data from May, but it has further gone down, so it's around 5%. Energy prices now have fallen back to 2021 levels, so normal levels. Of course, I've heard our colleagues from Fresh. Well, there is a question mark about this winter. Last winter in Europe, we were quite lucky. The winter was quite mild, so we didn't have major issues, but the weather is unpredictable. So let's see what happens with energy prices this winter, because obviously that will have a huge impact on everyone in the chain, from primary to producers, processors, and to retailers as well, especially fresh vegetables, considering the importance there of the cold chain for food safety, and the fact that freezers and fridges have to go on 24/7. So that's a huge effort on energy prices for the whole chain. Commodity prices for food are slightly down, question marks over some increases now for cereal that have in general then an impact on the whole chain. But yeah, you can see on the sort of top right now, the big issue is food inflation in Europe that remains high. Now it says there 12%. I think now it's more around 9%. So it is slightly going down, but it remains quite high and a major worry for consumers. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what has happened what has all of this meant for retailers? Obviously, if you look at various data, you may see sales going up. I mean, these are data which are maybe a few months old now. Actually, even sales are not as high as 3%. But obviously, this is really only due to inflation and higher prices in supermarkets. Because if you look at volumes, the situation is very worrying. So volumes have decreased pretty much non-stop for pretty much all products that you can find in supermarkets since late 2021, early 2022. So you can see there the data from February is about -5%, but now it's even worse for food retail in general. Next slide, please. And yeah, so what have we seen in store? What have consumers done? How have they reacted to high prices, to the high energy prices that they had, in their home for their heating, for their fuels, and also for food? So we have seen clear down trading trends. So consumers have changed the way they shop, and unfortunately, and relatively important for this group, one of the first thing they have decided to cut is fresh food. So meat, especially seafood, I would say, but also fresh fruit and vegetables. And for those of you who are interested, huge drop in organic as well, to buy products that are cheaper and sort of longer lasting, pasta, rice, canned products, also canned fruit, canned vegetables. They have changed the way that they shop. They have changed the places where they go shopping. So obviously, less smaller shops, less fewer organic shops, to go towards bigger shops, supermarkets, hypermarkets, and especially obviously discounters. So everyone is always looking for the best deal, and this is the same for everyone: high-end consumers and low-end consumers. So everyone is changing the way that they do their grocery shopping. So as I say, obviously you can see an increase in market share for the discounters. And I mean, maybe not super relevant for this meeting, but obviously a big switch from A brands to the supermarket own brands. So there in the bottom, you can see the result of a survey that we run every year on the state of grocery retail in Europe. I know that McKinsey, with whom we collaborate, also does the same for sure for North America. I'm not sure about other countries and regions in the world. But there you can see clearly what I was saying. So consumers are looking for ways to save money when shopping. They are looking for promotions, bulk savings, and they are looking less and less to buy high quality products, premium products. So that can mean maybe relevant to all of you, geographical indications, short supply chains, local products, not only national, but really, from very, very short supply chains. They are less interested in paying a higher price to get a healthier product. As I said, they are not as interested in organic product, and they are not as interested in sustainability. So this is what we have seen. Next slide, please.
I'll just collaborate that information that we are looking at that in Canada. I know we've seen other data from around the world. Your numbers may be slightly different, but almost identical.
Yeah. What has not changed is the attitude. So the attitude towards fresh fruit and vegetables remains very positive. The problem is translating that attitude into purchasing in these economic circumstances. So this is something that I just found a couple of days ago. This apologies that it's in French, but 96% of French consumers want to continue buy fresh fruit and vegetables. But as you see, what do they look at when buying fresh fruit and vegetables? They look at seasonality, they look at origin, they look at visual aspect. And I was reading in the chat, perhaps there's also something that we can all work on, I think the campaign was about, ugly vegetables, and the fact that they are ugly doesn't matter. And we can work together to stretch the nutritional value of this and to ensure consumers pay less attention to the visual aspect. And then you can see 39% of consumers, when looking at fresh fruit and vegetables, they look at price, but that's gone up almost 10% in 1 year. So that is really, really, a clear trend also for fruit and vegetables. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is another thing that I thought you might find interesting. This is from Italy. This is a recent survey. So consumers say they are willing to accept different price increases for different products before changing their habits. So you can see clearly broken down on the right. So I'm willing to accept up to 3% plus 3%, 4 to 6, 7 to 10, or I will continue to buy regardless of the price increase. And there you can see the average accept increases for the various products. And you see fruit and vegetables around both 6% for Italian consumers, but I think it's probably very similar at least in countries that are similar in terms of consumer behavior to Italy, to Spain, France. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I was saying, the attitude of consumers towards fresh fruit and vegetables is very positive, but the problem is, does that translate to their grocery behavior? And we have seen pretty much across the board. I'm going to present just a few data from a few countries, but this is really true for the whole of Europe, and I suspect for your countries as well. Volumes decreases, which are quite important. So you can see France, for fruit, 6% compared to 2023 compared to 2022, 8% 2023 compared to the 3-year average. In the 3 average, consider that there are also 2020 and 2021, so COVID years, so special years, very, very good years for grocers, and especially for products like fresh fruit and vegetables. A lot of consumers could save on holidays and traveling and restaurants, and so they spent more at supermarkets. So bear that in mind when you look at the 3-year average. In Germany, you can see decreases for vegetables. Here is then in the next slide you can see Spain. Here you can see for Spain also compared to other products. So yeah, around 9% here as well. In France was around 8%. So fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, both 9%. Meat doing slightly better. Fish, as I was saying earlier, doing probably the worst category that we've seen performing. Next slide, please. Italy. Here again, yeah, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, doing slightly better in Italy in 2023. But yeah, you can definitely see the volumes going down. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to wrap up, what is going to happen in the future and how does that affect willingness to pay by consumers for fresh fruit and vegetables and for sustainable fresh fruit and vegetables as well. We expect a normalization of prices, at least in Europe. I cannot really talk for other countries. So as you know, input costs have gone down, commodity prices have gone down, energy prices have gone down. So if the situation stays like this, retail prices will go down as well. So there is always a sometimes significant lag between agri prices and retail prices, because obviously those prices have to be negotiated down the chain. And some countries have, a tradition of long-term contracts between suppliers and retailers. So those prices take a while to go down. There's also lags in other costs that retailers have that take time, like their labor costs, for instance. And their own negotiations with, for instance, energy providers. But we think that in the last part of this year, we will see a normalization of prices, and so volumes will slightly pick up. I don't know if we'll ever go back to the situation pre, the inflationary crisis, when in Europe, inflation was always quite controlled around 2%. I don't know if this will be possible, but it will go, below 5%. Also, food prices. Some things that will stay: the value of own brands, of supermarkets' own brands. Consumers have tried them; they have liked them. They like the prices, but they also like the quality. And supermarkets are investing a lot in their private label, also, to have different ranges, to have the Premier Prix or basic prices, but also, say, more refined versions of their private labels. Online growth, I mean, this is all part of our state of grocery retail. So we also look at e-grocery, which is quite minor for now, but it is definitely a trend to look at and to monitor. And then, as I was saying, the key question really for the future is sustainability and sustainable products. The importance of sustainability continues to increase despite the current dip in demand, but we are not sure that consumers are willing to pay, will be willing to pay a lot more for sustainability. So one solution will be, huge cooperation efforts in the chain altogether to solve issues such as food waste that we know is mainly happening at consumer level, but I think the chain has a responsibility to, to educate consumers, to explain. Someone mentioned, nutritional considerations and health and labels. That is something else that the chain can develop together and can work together on. Emissions. This is all considerations which are quite important, and we need to explain to consumers that sustainability is important. Someone mentioned what is the biggest threat that we have probably to food security now that you primary producers have many times is climate change, unexpected weather events. So we definitely have a lot that we can do together there. I think I'll stop here, and if there are questions.
And thank you, and thank you to everyone still staying with us. We're going to run a bit long because this has been a very, very great conversation and great presentation. Nicolo, I think you really framed well that retail perspective. I think it was important to wrap up the session with that. Now, from taking it from here, I'd like to look at the piece around where do we go and what's the really the prospects looking at that dynamic future. So let's go over to Philippe Bénard with Freshfelt. And Philippe, if you can take a few minutes quickly just to frame up your quick thoughts on where is that dynamic future for your perspective in Europe.
Yes, and thank you very much, Ron. I will try to keep it short. But I think we have some important messages because they have been behind some of the presentation a bit of pessimism, but I think it's maybe important sometimes to remind some of the basics of our sector. to remind that we are probably fortunate and we should be proud to work in the fresh produce sector because we bring freshness, we bring diversity of production, we bring different tastes and textures to consumer. We have year-round supply, we have also seasonality, we have locality, we provide nutrition and healthy diet, we bring affordable products to consumer, and we bring also some solutions to societal concerns. So I think we have to be responsible, but also aware about our asset. And I think the coalition that you animate is also a fantastic platform where we can share experience and try to strengthen the unique benefit that we have in our sector. Before maybe going into some of the assets, I think it's also important to remind that our sector has shown resilience. So we are there. We have been crossing a number of crises. We have been moving around geopolitical turmoil. We have been facing consumption challenge, which continue, but also heavy competition from the agro-food sector, which sometimes try to appropriate the positive image of our sector and show a little bit the benefit with strong marketing that we don't have necessarily in our sector. We are facing climate change and at the same time rising costs. So I think that's maybe a cocktail which might be a little bit complex and difficult, but I'm sure we will continue to show resilience. And we can show resilience because we are in a business which is only based on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, because we are structured around the 3 pillars of sustainability, bringing a lot of benefit for the environmental pillar, because we are with a relatively low impact on the environment, on the social pillar, because we bring health to consumer, but also we facilitate keeping the farming business into the rural area, which is quite important for all the regions around the world, which move towards urban society. And we have also a strong economic asset. We have seen some of the complexity of the supply chain, which brings a lot of work across the sophisticated supply chain that we have. So I think all the 3 pillars are important, but obviously the third pillar, which is the economic one, is very important, in particular when we look at the difficult balance between the rising cost, the difficulty of the consumer to have purchasing power. But looking at the dynamics, I think in Europe we are relatively, I don't know whether I have to say well positioned, but we have been at the front of the move towards the Green Deal, towards the Farm to Fork strategy, which at the end is moving to a different business model, which requires a transition towards this more sustainable food supply chain. This requires time, this requires a soft transition, it requires also a lot of investment that the sector has to take, maybe in difficult time. So we need to see how this could be taking place. But we need also in this transition, and I think the policymakers have also still to be very well aware that at the end it's the market that will decide. So we have to listen what the consumer wants, but very important to listen the perspective of Nicolo from what the retailer are perceiving from the consumer attitude. So I think we have to have all of that, and also importantly, I think we have to be accountable when we tell our stories regarding our good environmental or water footprint or nutritional value. I think we need to be able as a sector to provide good response to the consumer expectation. But I think on the dynamic, it is also important to remind that we are an essential sector, that we are there to provide solutions. I think there will be no carbon neutrality if we don't take the benefits of the carbon sequestration that our sector could do. There will be no healthier lifestyle if we cannot provide all the property of our product in regard to health, contributing to eliminating some of the non-communicable disease. And there are many other aspects that I will not go into detail. But I think it's important that our sector are not only exposed to the scrutiny of NGO and consumer, but that we can take the lead in, and we have taken the lead in the last 20 years, being the pioneer of developing good agriculture practice, in moving into certification, in going sometimes even further than the legislation. So I think we, as a sector, provide response, going sometimes much faster than what politicians want us to do. And we are now already looking at other challenges, biodiversity, the soil health, and all the other elements which are very important. So I think we should stay a proactive sector. We should not work alone. I think we need to be supported by public authority who has to guide us and maybe facilitate innovation, facilitate financing into this. It's important that we left nobody behind, because I think the survey that we have seen have shown that there are maybe some growers which might not go on business anymore. They are not covering their cost of production. So I think this is not a good solution, because we are a sector for the future, which has to provide all its positive elements to secure the affordability of the supply chain of fruit and vegetable. And just no doubt on will be a win-win-win solution, win for the planet, win for the consumer, and definitely win for the sector, which has to provide much more fruit and vegetable if we want to raise the consumption to the right level that the WHO recommend, or as Joanna has said, we have to be even more ambitious and go to the 800 grams that the Nordic Council has been suggesting. I will leave it here. I've been speaking fast. Fortunately, there were no simultaneous translation, so I hope the message is fast. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Philippe. And because we've run 15 minutes over, I apologize to everyone. I think, Stephen, maybe I can just ask, you had framed up the opportunity for innovation out of Africa, and the pineapple example was fabulous. So maybe we can leave that and just let the audience understand that we have an opportunity here to work together. And our email address is here on screen. Please reach out to Ellen. If we can ask all the speakers to come online as we wrap up. Ellen is our secretariat. Ellen is here to support us driving forward, and you who are participating. So if you have questions, please email info@producecoalition.net. What I think we've heard today is key. We operate in a food system, and food systems are complex and integrated models that require all players to work together. If we can find that balance between the complexity and the integration, and framing the collaboration and partnerships to move product from working with inputs through the field, through the supply chain and logistics, and then retail, wholesale retail, and then to the consumer, I think we will find the solutions. And at the same time, linking in our public partners to make sure all of these connections are done in a seamless environment without any barriers to trade and movement of product as well. So thank you, all of our speakers today. Very great panel discussion on the impacts, great information relative to where we see the global markets. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Alan, relative to looking at that relationship between buyer and seller, and Nicolo framing up where's the consumers going, the retail perspective. I think without all those elements together, supporting the presentations from the coalition members, it really did frame a positive framework. I think looking at the opportunity moving forward that we're showing here today, together we can find success. So with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the participants who have joined us, and look forward to future webinars. We'll be moving forward and looking at delivering in the coming months.